Oh, hello, peoples. It's time. Sorry, I got sidetracked there for a second. All right, tonight's show, we're going to jump right into this because we don't have any reason not to at this point. I want to go ahead and introduce our guests. Of course, both are returning guests. Jessica, say hi.
Hi, everyone.
And Victor.
Hello.
We get a lot of fan mail about you, Victor.
What?
Yeah, well, sort of fan mail. No, dead serious, man. Some of your shows are some of the most popular ones.
That's cool. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Good to know.
You didn't tell me I'd be co-starring with a celebrity.
No, actually, yeah. It was. He's been on the show enough times now that he has to have a hot one here or there, you know. It's like a shot gag, right?
You do enough of them, something's going to stick.
So tonight we are doing something that this is an experiment here, folks, because we had discussed early on in the beginning before the show that we weren't going to get into one of these bitch fests. Why this is better than this one? Blah blah blah. You know, do it going back and forth between the old and the new World of Darkness. So tonight we're not going to do that either. Just say it. We're going to talk about it. Now I guarantee you, if you have a down aspect of the one you particularly play, go ahead. You know, because not everybody's happy with everything. So I'm going to throw the first question out, Jess, since I don't have a co-host tonight. My brother Victor or Jacob is previously engaged. That's all you're going to find out. I'm vague booking. So let's just do this. All right, Jessica. Why Lost? For you, why Lost?
It was interesting because, Changeling was also my favorite of the old World of Darkness games as well, and so I was approaching it with a bit of trepidation when I heard that a new version of it had come out. But I find it really offers a real diversity of playable character types, and I find the themes of loss and wonder and possibility and anguish just really quite appealing. And I also like that the stories tend to be a bit more sort of human in scale. So it's not sort of necessarily vast globe-spanning institutions. It's the local court structure, it's the local politics between the different courts and everything like that. And also the stories that are created when the individual player characters are coming to terms with what it means to have, lost everything. And to have a piece of your soul still hanging from the thorns of that hedge. I find it very fascinating.
That's a very, it's a really artistic expression of that. That was spot on.
I have a question based on something that you said. You mentioned you like the more intimate stories. I can only assume compared to, classic World of Darkness Changeling. It's interesting to me that you say that because, at least in my experience and with the Changeling groups that I run in, Changeling the Dreaming is the one game from classic World of Darkness that plays that way. Like, I don't think I've ever been in a Dreaming game that didn't deal with local, almost exclusively.
Yeah, and that's true. I wasn't necessarily thinking more local compared to Lost, so much as more local in scale compared to a lot of the other World of Darkness games.
Okay, that totally makes sense. I think that's one of the handful of things the games have in common, actually, when you're talking Dreaming and Lost. Something about fairy stories, I feel like it tends to lend itself to that. There's a whole like, in theory, area of Changeling the Dreaming that could be globe spanning, and I just don't know anyone who plays with it.
I mean, hypothetically, you could have national courts. You could have you could create a national structure that has, or an international structure that has sort of a supreme high monarch or something that is in charge of all of the different local courts. I haven't seen anything like that as much. There have certainly been attempts, but it just seems to sort of go against the grain, I guess.
Well, and just disclaimer for everyone, I know a little bit about Lost and a lot about Changeling, the Dreaming. Same sort of trepidation that Jess just described. From what I know of Lost, I would think that the international or big national international structures wouldn't make a lot of sense, just because one of the main themes of the game is you want to find some sort of baseline of normal again. I mean, even the loose, like, air quotes, morality trait, clarity, is all about keeping perspective and staying grounded and staying in yourself and not losing yourself and going over the top. And all that sort of big, large scale, I would think, would really pull a Lost character away from all of that.
Yeah, it could be. It's also, I also think that there's a balance between having city and numbers and having institutions that are so big that they end up drawing attention. There's a lot of sort of one of the major themes of Lost is sort of this ongoing struggle to not be retaken, to stay free. So I suspect that part of the reason why sort of larger institutions can feel wrong for the game is because that would make it more difficult for the Lost to hide, in some ways. That's not to say that it's not possible. In one of the Dark Era's era sort of descriptions, it has to do with the Brothers Grimm and the standardization of contracts. Because apparently, previous to the era of the Brothers Grimm, Changeling magic worked a little bit differently everywhere that you went. So, contracts in Germany might look a bit different from contracts in England, which might look very different from contracts in Canada. And it wasn't sort of until the Brothers Grimm started collecting these stories, almost sort of moving to collate and standardize, not standardize exactly, but you sort of see what I mean, that the rules were the same for everyone. Now that's some new material that just came out with the second edition, so I'm not sure what kind of uptake that sort of theme will get.
Have you noticed a drop-off in Lost players now that the new rules for Changeling are out?
Well, they aren't really.
I mean,
do you mean the
Dreaming.
new rules for Changeling the Dreaming?
Yeah, that's
Dreaming.
what I meant. I'm sorry. Yeah, the new change, since there does not appear to be anything about them continuing on the New World of Darkness lines, are they?
Yeah.
Yes,
they're doing.
absolutely.
Yeah, they're doing second editions of everything. Changeling the Lost just left. Second edition just left development. Month and a half ago. It's in art direction. They're about to have a Kickstarter. It's going to be the first second edition that they're going to do a Kickstarter for.
I'm so excited. You have no idea.
Listen to her. She started fangirling.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Changeling was crazy popular on the first Dark Era's book. So they're going to try a Kickstarter for second edition Changeling the Lost. It's supposed to start like a couple weeks after Cavaliers of Mars ends. It has 2 days left, so I think that Kickstarter will probably drop in the next 2, maybe 3 weeks.
I saw something about the Cavaliers of Mars. Is that a new?
Yeah, that's a totally different game, different system.
Yeah, different. I know. I get a lot of stuff coming across my feed, and I retain some of it.
Yeah.
To address your question. Something that Victor alluded to earlier is there's not really that much commonality between Dreaming and Lost.
There is not.
There's broad similarities, like they both have Fae elements to it, and they're both, as Victor pointed out, sort of local in scale, but that's really where the similarities end, unless there's something else that I'm not considering.
Completely new game mechanics?
Yeah. I mean, I was just brushing up on Lost, and there are some weird aesthetic similarities that if I'm going to be honest, I think they just kept to try and hook fans of Dreaming. But by and large, they're window dressing. Like the core stuff, the mechanics, the way magic works, all of the psychological themes, all that stuff is totally different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. It was funny. Like when you messaged me to come on this show, I was in the middle of editing an article for Keep on the Heathlands, comparing Changeling the Dreaming and Changeling the Lost, which I thought was really funny.
Really?
Yeah, and that specific article, though, it wasn't a broad comparison. It was talking about basically subgenres in horror. There's a quote from Stephen King that I used as the opening to the article about how horror is fundamentally conservative. And
so
not like
I guess now would
conservative.
not be the time to tell you about the bug I have on you.
What? Huh? I know you have me bugged. It's fine. Ignore all the porn.
That's porn. It's piffle. I have no issue. I want no porn. I want good shit.
But anyway, so go ahead.
I was just with respect to the horror. There seems to be this misconception out there that Changeling is the sort of the light and fluffy.
No.
And
Neither of them are.
Yeah.
No, I know that much.
The coexistence of the wonder and the magic and the possibilities with like the loss and the destruction and the fact that all changelings and Lost are slowly going insane is really. Yeah. I find that it's
just
really
a bummer,
amps
man.
up the darkness because that juxtaposition is there. So you really see both ends of the spectrum, which sort of really multiplies the effect that each of them have to my mind.
I mean,
I don't think there are any light and fluffy versions of the splats in this system. Well, I don't think they're all pretty nasty in their own special way.
I will say there are some people who read very early editions of Changeling the Dreaming, and they weren't always good at getting, I'll say, the whole theme into the core book. And we affectionately call them fish puka among my friends. There are definitely people who play Changeling the Dreaming in a way that perpetuates that stereotype. I describe puka players a lot the way I describe Malkavian players. I don't dislike Malkavians. I just dislike
like bad
players.
Malkavians, the ones who can't play their character.
Yeah, I mean, there is a root for that reputation. It's not in the actual games.
Yeah, I mean, you can play any game that way. Like I've definitely seen vampire games where everybody's like superhero with fangs, but
superheroes with fangs, yeah. But the thing I was talking about earlier, because I think it relates to what you were talking about in terms of, the sort of darkness and horror that's been lost. The thing I talked about in that article, this quote from Stephen King about how horror is fundamentally conservative, and not politics conservative, but like maintain the status quo. Some horrible thing comes from the dark. It upsets your status quo. It makes you feel unsafe, and you want to then reestablish the status quo. Changeling the Lost is very much in that mold, and there's a long, long tradition of horror in that. Lovecraft, almost everything released in the 80s, a horror label on it. What I realized, because I saw one of the developers for Mage talking about that quote on Facebook, it's what got me thinking. It was like a year ago, and then I ended up writing this article. Changeling the Dreaming is exactly the opposite. The status quo is terrible. The status quo will kill you. It's slowly creeping into you, and it's destroying you. Humanity is awful. You are the thing from the outside that upsets the status quo. You are, this thing that is having to survive against the horrible banality of the world. And I realized, when I thought about that, most of the horror I tend to like is that anti-status quo horror. Things like The Babadook. You go through that whole movie thinking, this is a horrible monster. Oh, no, the monster is the status quo. The monster is normalcy, and normalcy cannot be allowed to return. And Mask of the Red Death from Edgar Allan Poe, there's some other examples. Yeah. I really love that stuff. And I've found largely, I've met a handful of people that really love Dreaming and Lost. But I found largely most of the people I know who love Dreaming and don't particularly care for Lost fall into that completely burn down the status quo sort of mentality. And then the people that really love Lost and really can't stand dreaming really like that kind of traditional horror. And the really interesting slice are when you find people that kind of like both games. Even if they have one preference or the other, if they like both games, I find those are really fascinating people to kind of bounce things off of, because they tend to have perspectives that I'm less likely to have seen before. But after a lot of thinking about and trying to figure out what is it about these games, because I have a certain relationship with these games and I've never totally gotten it, especially with Lost, because man, I love the Lost systems, but there's that whole I remember when I read the book the first time and I kept flipping going, where do I find the person that loves being Fae? Where do I want to where's my I love being Fae character? And I got to the end of the book and I'm like, there's the Autumn Court. It's not really what I'm talking about. What?
Actually, for that strikes me as a fairest winter courtier, somebody who misses the magic and the possibility of Arcadia.
I remember reading about that. The thing that struck me about, at least the way they framed it in the core book, and I have talked to some people that have told me it's different a little in the source books, is that they framed it very much as, this is Stockholm Syndrome. This is PTSD. Don't play it directly. This is still trauma. There was just a drumbeat of that in the core book, at least. And I was just looking for that, deep celebratory, I'm here to screw up your status quo. I didn't recognize it as that at the time.
That would be the Dawn Court.
Yeah, but even the Dawn Court is still all about, because I was just reading them earlier in preparation for this, they're still all about fighting the true Fae. They're still all about, it's still defined by horror of the gentry. And that was the part that I was like, where's the character that's not the defining thing? And it wasn't a reasonable thing to look for. This was me as this was me at 20, probably 20. And all I had really played was Dreaming. And it took me a long time to go over it and be like, okay, no, I see why I had this relationship with this content. It was weird. It took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around that and start to think about, okay, what are the sorts of stories that each of these games are good at? Because they're good at really, really different stories. And I especially love things like the fact that all the magic in Lost is defined as contracts you have with the world. Arts are cool. I like a lot of the arts. But just that narrative punch of no, you have these fire powers because somewhere along the way you made a contract with fire.
You don't have magic, you're a supernatural lawyer.
Yeah, you are.
Sign here, initial here.
Yeah, I mean, so and I like the fact that in C20, some of the things I really loved from Lost that were never in Dreaming have come over, but not at the same level. Lost still wins on contracts. It's just, I love the way all of contracts are framed in Lost.
Well, and the pledge system as well. That whole, you make a bargain, but you have to keep certain conditions in mind. That is so cool.
Yeah, it really is. The other thing, and Dreaming made a stab in C20 at fixing this, and I think they took kind of a step in the right direction. But the other thing I always really liked about Lost is that you don't have splats like the old World of Darkness had splats.
No.
You have great big huge umbrellas. If you're not a satyr, you're a beast. And what does that mean? And you get to decide your character.
Kind of beast.
Yes. But what that means, you have to do a lot more creative lift. And I know players that love that. I know players that want their characters handed to them on a silver platter.
Yeah.
I tend to like the creative lift.
I'm the same way.
Yeah. So I actually have a friend who's running. I co-host a Changeling the Dreaming podcast with him, and
he's running. Get your plug out of the way. Get it out of the way now.
Walking away from Arcadia. Yeah, sure, great, whatever. I want to talk about what he's doing to get around to that one limitation of dreaming more than anything. He's a hardcore dreaming guy, kind of like me, but that was definitely a failing. He didn't like the strict kiths. And so he's running, like, Dreaming Story with Dark Ages Fae system, and Dark Ages Fae is even more wide open than Lost. Like, it's just... Here's a system
there'd be much less banality, I guess, at that period in history. I mean, granted, humanity's taken over the planet, and they're slowly starting to fuck things up, but they haven't really begun in earnest yet.
It's complicated. Dark Ages Fae doesn't have banality.
Oh, it doesn't?
No, there's no banality, but it has the composite forces that will turn into banality. Banality is weird because it's not just a thing you want to avoid, it's also a power trait, which is something that a lot of people miss. And
I imagine banality is like the nothing storm in Never Ending Story.
I was a knocker player, so I can very much appreciate the I have appreciation for banality as part of your constellation of stats.
Yeah, well, and interestingly, they've kind of done away with the knocker affiliation with banality in C20. They're not particularly more banal than any other Kith anymore, because they've made banality 100% personal. So it's not that they wade into this thing that's banal. It's not banal to them. But it's around like a she who's not House Dougal, or like a Boggin who just thinks that everything should be done with your hands, and then they get super techie. They might literally invoke self-inspired glamour at the same time that they cause a banality trigger in the face standing next to them. But those two characters' personal relationship with glamour and banality is so different. It was a really interesting change. I'm just starting to like wrap my head around it in the games I'm running. It's kind of fascinating. But what I was saying about Dark Ages Fae, there's the power half of banality, weaving, which is just your ability to shape the world and give it structure. But then there's echoes, because Dark Ages Fae is set during the period where the Catholic Church was starting to demonize fairies.
Yes, it was,
and taking them from like
the beginning
worship
of the Great Burning.
Yeah, and so there are these two separate things that represent two totally different aspects of what you can, if you step back and squint, kind of tell will someday become banality. And so it's interesting. It's really weird because it just plays so utterly unlike Dreaming.
I didn't know about the echoes in Dark Ages Dreaming. That's interesting, because that's what the fetch powers are called in Lost. Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's...
All right, give us an example of fetch power.
For example, a very powerful fetch can summon a true fae.
Oh, you just conjure up Titania. Hey, what's up?
Well, that's one of the reasons why Lost characters tend to have either an avoidant or a hostile relationship with their fetch, because there's always this suggestion that the fetch could be working and in contact with the fae, because the fae was what gave them life.
Okay. Huh?
Yeah, so this actually brings something up that I read earlier today, and I'm really curious about your opinion on it. So I was looking at the Clarity Hierarchy of Sins. I know that's not what they called it, but it just looks so much like a Vampire the Masquerade Hierarchy of Sins. And there's this level...
Totally a hierarchy of sins, let's be real.
It's a hierarchy of sins. I'm like, come on, guys. Like, how long has it been since you came up with that system? You can do something else. But there's a level where you either, I forget if it's lose clarity or risk losing clarity. I didn't totally have time to wrap my head around the system again.
You roll a test to see if you lose clarity.
Okay. You roll a test for killing a changeling. Kind of get that because of the whole changeling relationship they have with each other and what they are. But you also get one for destroying a fetch. And I looked at that and I was like, I guess I can kind of get that, but it's also really weird because I don't know. Like, how do you feel about that whole scale?
The true fae ripped out part of your soul and put it into your fetch. So, in a sense, you're killing yourself if you off your fetch.
So this was killing
just
any
not
fetch.
good.
This was killing any fetch, although I could see how having that impact on another changeling through their fetch, I can kind of see that. That makes a little more sense.
There's also this tradition that if the fetch is going to be killed, it should be the changeling, because then they can reclaim that piece of their soul. Whereas if I am an unrelated changeling and I off somebody else's fetch, they've lost the opportunity to regain that part of themselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
By the way, as a side note, the girl who did our logo, Cecile, was supposed to be here tonight too. Oh. And she had something come up at the last minute, which means she's still got a show. So there will be at least one more Changeling show.
Yeah, and that's just my take on it. I'm not sure how other storytellers have handled that. I spent the past way too long being primarily a storyteller. And to circle back to something you were saying earlier about the conservative nature of horror and wanting to reestablish the status quo, that's actually a big challenge that I had as a storyteller, because a win for the character is a very boring thing for a player to play through, because the changelings just want to go back to having a normal life in which they can function in the world and, you know, be reasonably successful and have nothing go horribly wrong for them. Mm-hmm. Whereas that would be a very boring game.
Boring. God.
So yeah. I can actually think of. I thought of one way that you could totally invoke that. If you had a game where, you know, you're playing for a while and then somebody wants to change a character or has to leave, you know, it happens. And instead of killing their character or just having them disappear, give them a way to return to their normal life. I know technically you can't do it, but, you know, it's a storyteller system. You can do whatever you want. And have
you actually can if you merge with your fetch.
Aha, okay. But have them backstab the rest of their group to do it. Because I always read Lost as there kind of being an undercurrent of like, yeah, you're my motley, and I love you and I care about you. But no, really, if I had the opportunity, we all know I would take it. And by the way, so would all of you. Mm-hmm. So I think you're absolutely right. A win like for a character who is playing as a whole role-playing thing, I agree, that would be super boring. But I could totally see it being like a transition into NPC move that could prompt a bunch of other story.
Yeah, I actually did that with somebody was retiring their character, and we decided between the two of us that what happened was she attempted to merge with her character's fetch, and it went wrong, such that the fetch was the dominant one. Mm-hmm. There's nothing saying that it's the changeling's personality that will win out necessarily. It's just everybody sort of assumes that's how it will go.
Yeah, but things never go well in the X of darkness.
It's not supposed to. Again, wouldn't be very much fun if it did.
Yeah.
So, I mean, she sort of won in that she went back to having a normal life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and those are the sorts of things that I think... Those are the sorts of things that I think sort of separate Lost in a lot of ways from Dreaming, is that whole relationship, like that yearning. And the other interesting thing that I find that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is, you know, I've been talking a fair bit recently on, you know, the episodes I've done with Simon and just after the game of Dreaming I ran at Gen Con, about how the Fae in Old World of Darkness are super amoral. Like, I ran this Gen Con game, and just the things that the players did were monstrous. Just straight up monstrous. In the sort of way that even in Vampire, you'd be like, okay, we're like 25 humanity rolls in. Guys, seriously, you need to reel it in. And there's nothing. There's nothing to hold them accountable because they're the Fae and they don't care. And then I was reading the Clarity system, and I'm like, wow, man, if they had behaved this way in Lost, they'd all be stark raving mad by now. And
especially since in Clarity you can commit sins without actually doing anything wrong. Like, you could have sins happen to you. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting how the game that got that reputation as bright and shiny, Changeling the Dreaming, has some of the most monstrous PC like anything. It actually came up around one of the arts in the new version of Changeling. They added a bunch of arts because Changeling needed some diversification in its powers, and some reconciliation. They did a bunch of stuff, and they added seasonal arts, which Lost has always had. I think that has 2 contracts for each season, marginal and just like
3.
Full force, yeah. But seasonal arts for Changeling the Dreaming were new, and Winter is brutal. Winter's like, I'm going to make you not feel anymore. Or I'm going to put...
That's pretty much as it is in Lost as well.
Yeah, but the thing that's interesting about it, though, is the powers kind of weirdly line up with things that are normally associated with banality. And Changeling has this whole relationship with, like, feeling and inspiration and passion and glamour, and then banality. And then, like, the 5th level is, I put you in stasis, and I turn you into a statue. And they give an example of a red cap that just, like, collects a little family. If you've seen Dollhouse, they basically described the serial murderer who kept the, like, drugged statue people to recreate his family.
Sort of like the Witch from Narnia?
Kind of, yeah, very much like that. And it was interesting because that is a PC power. But in all the other classic World of Darkness games, you have, like, Daemonon, Dark Thaumaturgy, the Dark Fomori, or not Dark Fomori, Dark Arcanoi, you have Fomori powers. You have things that a lot of them aren't even as bad as that, honestly. And they're in the, oh, no, PC gets to have this territory. And I thought it was really interesting that in Changeling, game that has this bright, shiny reputation, it was like, nope, no, that's fine, go nuts. There is one art.
You can do horrible things to each other, it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine, it's no big deal. Who cares?
I actually got in the most ridiculous argument with a player as a storyteller because the freehold oath that they'd arrived upon prohibited members of the freehold from harming each other, which not recommended. Do not recommend. And one of the Winter Courtiers used their Winter Court contracts to rob somebody of another member of the freehold of the ability to feel any positive emotion. I was like, so you broke your freehold oath? And he was like, no, that's fine. I was like, are you shitting me right now?
What? Okay, that's not how any of this works.
Right?
They broke their oath hard. Wow. No, that's fine. Oh, yeah. That's kind of up there. That's kind of up there with the conversation I had with the player at Gen Con who was like, oh, yeah, those 2 red caps are going to ambush us. Is there a cop around? Okay, can I convince the cop that I just saw 2 guys, like, drag some woman down that alley? I'm like, really?
Oop.
You're going to send this poor, unsuspecting, off-duty police officer with a pea shooter in against 2 red caps? He's like, sure, it'll distract them. And I'm like, okay.
Let's see how this goes.
I mean, it went dead cop is how it went.
Oh, jeez, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
The world is boring. Everything needs to die.
I'm gonna light stuff on fire because I'm bored.
I'm just bored.
Yeah. So I have a question. Jess, have you read Beast the Primordial at all?
Oh, I haven't read it. I was in this amazing cross-venue game where some people were playing Beasts, and so I sort of got a little bit of a sense of it. It did seem similar in some ways to Lost, but I haven't looked into it enough to really know.
Okay, so there's this dynamic with Beast that has been sort of scratching my brain. I'm curious how you feel about it. So Beasts are kind of Changeling-like-ish, but not exactly. Their magic is different, but they kind of have a mien. They feed off human horror, and they come from the primordial dream, which is different from the dreams that Changelings and Lost are part of, because Chronicles of Darkness. But the thing
because reasons.
Because reasons, yeah. But the thing about Beasts is they are totally friends with all the other splats in the Chronicles of Darkness except for demons. Like, Beast was designed to be totally crossover friendly. We want to do mixed groups, you shake it up with changelings and vampires and all these other things. specifically changelings are highlighted in the Beast Ready-Made character. The one non-Beast character they included to kind of highlight this dynamic was a changeling. But the thing that jumped out at me, especially when I went back and was reading Lost again, is beasts they're horrible. They're monsters. They terrify and traumatize and torment. And technically they have this like ethic about we're doing it to teach lessons through fear. But
negative reinforcement.
It's like it's made clear through the book that might just be some self-justification. There's a good chance, maybe not. But anyway, like they do these horrible traumatic things to humans and make them afraid of like being caught out unawares, being hunted, being exposed. And it struck me that, especially when I was reading Clarity, I have a hard time imagining changelings rolling with beasts and ever seeing them feed, and it not really attacking their clarity balance.
It might be. It might, depending on the precise specifics. However, the narrative that's being created there would probably make intuitive sense to a member of the Lost. A lot of Darklings became Darklings because they were in the wrong place at the time. They were warned and didn't listen, that sort of thing. There's also a changeling entitlement that's based around frightening people to teach them lessons using urban legends and just horrifying and traumatizing people. It's a fall court one, unshockingly. So
yeah, that totally makes sense.
I think that it would make sense to changelings as to what the beasts are up to. They might not necessarily like it, but they also don't necessarily like it when the fall court members start going a bit insane and start losing perspective.
Yeah, I was just curious about your thoughts on that. It's interesting to hear that they have powers that put them into that territory, because that's not something I would generally envision. Again, with my relatively limited lens from the core book.
It's like the members of the entitlement that I was talking about, and an entitlement is a noble order of changelings. I'm not sure if you were familiar with that aspect of the game. The power that they get is they have a mask, and they can put it on to basically become terrifying.
Yeah, that's just kind of straight up beast right there. That's interesting.
And their whole purpose is to try and, basically do it so that humans don't get taken, because a lot of the things that are behind these urban legends are fae. And
really?
Yes.
Huh.
Oh, yeah.
So, Slender Man. Shit like that.
I had stats for him.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was actually, I want to say it was a Darkling picture in the core book. It wasn't a male, it was a female, but just the way she was drawn and the instruments she had just made me think of Slender Man. Probably deviating from the actual urban legend a bit. She had a bunch of syringes and medical equipment, but it still just invoked that for me.
Anything in Silent Hill.
They're industry, and their whole thing is, okay, we might traumatize some people, but it's better than being taken.
I don't know, man. Don't sound right to me.
Well, I mean
well, and so this gets into something. I could totally see that psychology, but the clarity rules were very absolute. I've talked with a few people, and I've seen a couple exchanges online that lead me to believe that the player base has a somewhat loose relationship with the clarity system. Does that line up with your experience?
It's very hard to maintain your clarity, just in general, because, as I mentioned earlier, things can happen to you that you have no control over that cause you to lose clarity. So it's sort of this, when I said earlier that changelings are slowly going mad, I mean that quite literally. It's hard to be a changeling and keep perspective for the length of time that you would need to in order to be able to live a normal life. So your perception that changelings lose clarity a lot is accurate. Particularly if there's any kind of conflict going on. I remember Dogs of War, the military source book, is talking about how the splats engage in like military conflicts, and they're like, changelings don't tend to be well suited because it savages their clarity. And I mean,
well, and if you think about the fact that a lot of Lost is a metaphor for PTSD, that's not just a systematic quirk. Like, that's just straight up, yeah, they already have like 10 layers of PTSD. No, they're not going to do well in a war environment.
No, it doesn't.
You don't really need a
like
system for that.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like I'd want them in my foxhole, that's for sure.
well, they have useful abilities like that.
Yeah, but if they can't fight effectively, what's the point?
The suggested use for them in Dogs of War was ferrying goods through the hedge.
Now you're going to have to explain that.
So the hedge is this alternate realm that changelings have access to that none of the other splats can really access. It's the barrier between Arcadia, where they were taken, and the real world. Changelings can access the hedge as a matter of course. Sometimes normal humans end up in there because the hedge is a bit psychoactive.
Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, basically. That's basically the hedge. So changelings can use the hedge to traverse distances quite quickly.
Down the rabbit hole, no shit.
So they would make very effective scouts and supply runners in the event there was a conflict, because they could get to places that other people couldn't.
That's true. All right, but then yes, they does sound like they could be useful in some support roles. All right, I think I just saw some questions. Hold up, let me see. PTSD the game sounds like a fun night for all, both in and out of character.
You know, I know quite a few people that's kind of their favorite part of Changeling. They like diving into that.
I definitely am of the suffer puppet school of role-playing, so I'm quite happy to torment my characters for hours on end.
Right.
The suffer puppet. I'm going to have to remember that. That's kind of precious.
That is. See, I don't know what it is. Girls seem to come up with better nicks than guys do for some weird reason. It's just my own personal observations of dealing.
I can't take credit for that turn of phrase. I can't remember where I heard it.
But I guarantee you the girl who did, the person who did invent it was a girl. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah, so I saw a New Wave Masquerade making a comment about Beast.
Yeah.
So I'll just say, having read all of Beast, I did a review of it on Keep on the Heathlands. Beast has a couple rough edges, but I would say no more than any other game that I've seen come out of White Wolf / Onyx Path. The power level is ridiculous. It's a very high-powered game, but, you know, some of the games are higher-powered than others.
Some, like Mummy.
Yeah, I don't know that it's quite that ridiculous.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different kind of experience. Like, there's no real struggle with... There's not a lot of internal struggle when you're a beast, quite honestly. Like, there's
no shadow, no beast.
No,
nothing.
you are the shadow. You
are the shadow.
Like, I mean, you're a monster stalking existence, and you're totally, generally speaking, you're totally fine with being that. Like, there is no, oh, woe is I was embraced. There's none of that.
Angst.
Do anything about it either.
What?
From what I understand, you can't really do anything about it either.
No, you really can't. You can't do anything about it. Like, you know, there are some you fall too far off the knife's edge and completely give in to your hunger and become an even worse, completely mindless horror. Like, there are a couple plot hooks like that.
Like Spectres, or...
That's how you get heroes.
Right. Oh, yeah. Heroes are awful. Like, I have the core book, and the one source book I bought was Heroes Conquer, or, I forget exactly what it's called, the Heroes book. And the Heroes book is really unsettling. Like, they wrote up these characters, and it's a series of really in-depth NPCs that you can pull into your games. And they're all antagonists, but they're relatable in a horrible, awful way. Not like... Oh, that book is... That book was unsettling to read, especially the first character. I was like, she's not a villain. Oh, she's a villain. Oh man. Yeah, if you like Suffer Puppet, you should pick that book up just to have.
Just when you're feeling too good about yourself, let's
a little bit.
Keep this next to the bed, just in case.
Yeah.
What was it? Did they just suddenly go crazy at White Wolf? It's, I want the most depressing shit you can come up with.
Well, I mean, at Onyx Path. I mean, Beast is entirely an Onyx Path, baby.
No, more depressing.
Well, circling back to what you were saying about Changeling being a metaphor for PTSD, I've heard an interesting theory that the Spring Court is sort of like almost like the reaction you would get coming from a very abusive situation, where you're like, you know what, I'm gonna be so happy that you're not gonna even be able to relate to me anymore, because I'm gonna be so happy without you.
Yeah, the Spring Court is the closest thing I've seen in Lost to the metaphor I heard from the lead developer of Dreaming. And that was, he described dreaming as being someone putting a gun to your head and screaming at you to be happy. And the Spring Court is kind of like the opposite of that. It's like they put the gun to their own head, and then they're happy about it, just to make you really unsettled. Yeah, I can totally see what you're saying about that. And I really read all four of the courts as kind of different reactions to PTSD. Various mixtures of like rebellion, Stockholm, you name it. They're all a really interesting mixture of that. I saw on a dev post about Changeling the Lost 2nd Edition that they're trying to expand the game to go beyond just the trauma lens, although they said the trauma lens will still be central. And I don't know what that means, but I am kind of curious about it.
I think part of it was to try and take the focus off sort of Changeling as exploration of mental health issues. Because it used to be, the tag used to be a storytelling game of beautiful madness, and that's not necessarily the most sensitive to people who were having mental health issues. So I suspect that was part of the decision to shift focus.
Since I've been doing this show, it has come to my attention that everything in this game is going to trigger something in somebody. So why do you really need to, spend too much time, if I make my character this way, is that going to make her feel uncomfortable and not be able to play? Because she's not going to have her safe space or whatever.
Well, I mean, thoughts on that subject. I'm not sure. That's a whole conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
can understand. There is a line. I get that, and I know it when I see it. Can't give you a
But
specific.
the line is very different for different people.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a big believer in knowing where the line is for the players at my table and walking right up to that line and tickling the edge of it with a knife. Like, that's what horror, that's the
just
fun
wiggle
of horror.
Your toes.
Like, yeah, is playing with that line. I think part of what's challenging with, like, on the product level is, if I have 5 people at my table and I'm able to negotiate with them and I'm able to ask them, what areas do you want me to, like, punch your feels in, and what areas do you want me to maybe step away from?
Yeah.
Or maybe I know them well enough to know that landscape. I can navigate that pretty well. White Wolf Onyx Path, they have the more challenging job of they have to navigate the entire community.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I don't know. I don't think you can write off the need to navigate it. I think the difference in reception between, like, the Vampire Pre-Alpha and the Vampire Alpha is evidence of the fact that taking some time to navigate that has a lot of positive effects. It's worth doing. So,
I mean, for me as a storyteller, it's important for reasons of immersion, because what I've found is if you push somebody's boundaries to too great an extent, it tears them out of game and they can no longer interact with this plot that you've spent so much time designing. You can no longer contribute to the shared story that we're telling. So it's important to me, as a storyteller, looking to run the highest quality game that I can to ensure that everybody can participate. And this is not to say that, I'm some sort of bleeding heart person who just wants everybody to be safe in
Everybody
the hug
got
zone.
to-
Like,
yeah.
I make players cry. Like, that is a thing.
Sing Kumbaya and the whole. But yeah,
I think that it's important to, if you're going to make people cry, I think it's important that they find the experience cathartic as opposed to
as to traumatizing, yes.
Yes.
But
And-
here's my perfect example of what I was talking about. Do you think Mel Brooks could have got Blazing Saddles made today?
Yes,
No.
I actually
There's
do.
no way in hell.
I will respectfully disagree with that,
Okay.
based entirely
I'm
on
with
my
you.
conversations with
Even in 1974, it offended the hell out of everybody.
I'm gonna say it didn't. I had
I
several
was there. I
conversations-
remember. I loved it. I thought it was
Sure.
one of the coolest things I had ever seen.
So this was one of the things, and my parents were out in Hollywood around the time this movie came out. And I talked with them about this a lot, and one of the things they pointed out really consistently from the 70s is the people who were offended by that movie were white people. Because that movie is subversive and primarily attacks white people.
Yes, true.
And
But I don't think he could have gotten it made today without opening up their own studio like Quentin Tarantino's done. You know? Because he can make stuff like Django Unchained and get away with it because it's his own studio. But I couldn't see Mel Brooks getting Blazing Saddles made today. But that's what I was also pointing out, is what one person finds offensive, another person might find funny as fuck. Now, granted, that's not always a good thing, depending on what the horrible, you know what I'm saying.
yeah.
I think you can approach themes that are sensitive, provided that you acknowledge that they are sensitive and do it in a way that that honors that. And I mean, I'm not saying that I'm perfect at it. I've messed up before and really upset some people.
Yeah.
But I tried to.
Oh,
I
so
tried
have
to
I.
learn. I tried to
I
learn
did too.
from that.
Recently.
And I have been able to go to some really dark places with the people who played in my games, because I sort of developed the skills necessary to have those conversations, to read when people are feeling just uncomfortable enough and not too uncomfortable to engage.
Okay.
I mean, I think the other thing is, that like what you brought up of you've made players cry, but you want it to be cathartic. I think a lot of that is also the whole like knowing the boundaries of your players, because honestly, I know a lot of people who play World of Darkness who don't actually like horror. Like
That's true.
They like gothic horror, they like Poe, they like Lovecraft, but they will not sit down and watch a horror movie because it hits them in all the wrong ways, and they'll have night terrors for nights that they can't control.
they'll play
sleep.
vampire, but they won't watch The Hills Have Eyes.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think, if you approach this as, it's a horror game, I'm just going to go full, force into horror, you leave a lot of your potential player base to the side. And man, it's hard to find a full group already.
Yes, I see them post all the time in the groups. Hey, anybody play a game of whatever? And
There's a term from the Nordic LARP community about that. They refer to this as the cult of hardcore. People who want their games to be as horrific as possible, and for the line to be set at the person who has the most flexible boundaries. And there's this sort of thinking, well, if you can't handle this or that thing, then you shouldn't be playing darkness. And that's not really to my mind anyways, it's not really a healthy approach it, because as Victor points out, you lose a bunch of your potential players.
But there are some people that will play Iron Man or nothing.
Well, and so here's the thing. I think it's totally reasonable to run a game if you can find the right players, or if you do some sort of public game and you want to advertise it. You want to basically rate it and say, look, this is what we're doing. This is what we're looking to experience. I think there's a big difference between running a Chronicle or, a couple games like that and saying, oh no, if you don't play like this, you shouldn't be playing World of Darkness. I think those are two very different things. There is a place for just like full throttle, rip your heart out horror sessions. I mean, I love the Shoah. I'm glad the Shoah exists. I want there to be one good like Black Dog book on that level for Changeling the Dreaming. I think there's some great territory for that in Dreaming that doesn't get explored too much. But at the same time, I acknowledge that as, you know, valid for a certain set of games that I would totally love to play in on occasion. I wouldn't want it to be every game, though.
No, if you get, how should I put this? If you get shocked too many times, you become less sensitive to the shocks.
That circles back to what I was saying earlier about why I like Changeling, is because there's horror in there for sure. There's horror, there's darkness, there's despair, there's just all kinds of awfulness that exists in world. But there's also magic and wonder and other sort of things that you can move to, so that your players don't get desensitized to sort of the horrificness of the World of Darkness, and therefore makes it more effective.
Yeah, well, and so on those lines, we've talked a lot about Lost. One idea that came up one time when Simon and I were talking to each other in Changeling the Dreaming that deals with that. There is one of the things, I love that same thing about Changeling, the fact that there's wonder, the fact that you just love, in the case of Dreaming, you love what you are. In the case of Lost, there's this like, you know, tension between, oh, there's this thing that's terrible and it traumatized me, but like it's kind of beautiful too, and how do I feel about that? Like the lens of the wonder is different, but it is there in both games. But in Dreaming, you know, you're not cut off from your human self, your human family. You are still you're human, and occasionally you go into banality comas and just are totally human again and do have to re-enter that life that is toxic to you. But there could be people there that are just crush that horror and or crush that wonder and are horrible for you. You know, we were talking about what would happen if you were smack dab in the middle of some big dreaming quest, something totally critical to your court, and you're in the middle of it, and then you get the call that your mother is dying. Your human mother. And you love her to death, but she's an autumn person, and she has hurt you one too many times, but now she's dying. And, like, how does that shatter that wonder? And what does that bring up? And who do you leave to maybe die because they can't, like, handle the quest? Or do you let your mother die? And, like, those are the sorts of weird, like, it's not even horror. It's tragedy. Like, it's an internal sinking horror. It's not a monstrous horror. Those are the kinds of things that I like, that there's the opportunity in Changeling the Dreaming for that stuff to come up.
Yeah, the psychological aspect of it is my favorite as well.
Yeah. And it's... Yeah, it gets into a much more sinking, slow, creeping place than I think a lot of the other World of Darkness games do. Because most of the other World and Chronicles of Darkness games are much more in your face about the horror. There are one or two other creeping ones, like Promethean. Promethean's a slow burn.
Is it?
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about Promethean.
Yeah.
That's the Frankenstein. the Golem game. That was it.
Yes, the Golem game.
So yeah, I found that really interesting dynamic to explore as well. Now, I never ran Dreaming, but I played Dreaming, and I can remember my character having a relationship with an autumn person and like trying to figure out, okay, how do I even do this? Because like being near you literally hurts me.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I find really fascinating, Ian Lemke, who's the old line developer, he's still writing on the new line, but he's not the main developer anymore. Someone was posting in one of the groups and asked the question, could there be a Nunnehi Autumn person? And keep in mind, in the new edition, the old Dante and the Banal Changelings are completely rewritten. They're not Banal Changelings anymore. They're something else entirely. So they're out of the picture. But just like, could a Nunnehi be an Autumn person? And the Nunnehi are the Native American Fae. Totally different from European Fae. Completely and totally different. And he responded and said, yes, absolutely they could be. And the implications of that are really messy, especially because Dreaming does get into a lot of like cultural divides that Lost doesn't so much focus on. Like, the Nunnehi are totally different from the Cathane, and they're totally different in part because colonialism and genocide.
Oh, yeah.
And, I mean...
Remember this discussion. We've already had it.
Yeah, but, like, the idea that, like, oh, no, you could have a Nunnehi Autumn person, but it's like, oh, but what are the banality? What is a Nunnehi's relationship to banality? And is it cultural? And so what does that mean? And then you open this whole, like, door into, are we going to, like, tell stories about regional schools? Is that okay? Like, who's at this table? Dreaming gets into some really weird identity spaces.
I ran a plot having to do with some of the smallpox epidemics, speaking of sensitive
the blanket incident.
And so I spent some time navigating that space, and it, at least as far as I could tell, it ended up being a really positive experience, and I certainly learned a lot. So it'd be interesting to see how that ends up playing out.
Yeah, it's those sorts of dynamics are really interesting to me. I never, like, I want to dive into them, but I'm never sure. I don't know. It's like there's this anxiety about telling those sorts of stories.
I was lucky in that I had some help, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it helps a lot if you have someone to bounce ideas off of with maybe a little more relationship to that narrative. That's definitely something I would want before I tried to dive into any of those stories, but I do find that space in Dreaming really fascinating, because it's not something that the other World of Darkness games do so much. I mean, Vampire has kind of cross-cultural groups occasionally, but it's a bloodline. Okay, we're done here. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but it's kind of true. It's the way it tends to be presented.
It's a bit reductive.
It is. Werewolf...
Oh, God.
Werewolf is also kind of reductive in that respect, although in different ways. Mage does a better job of it. Mage, especially later editions... Well, M20 second edition do a pretty good job of it. Revised just try to be like, oh yeah, all these cultural groups will join the Hermetics. It's fine. Not a huge fan of that plot point.
There's some interesting sort of things that Lost did around different kits from different I guess myth spaces in the world. So like you have gremlins from Britain, and you have I'm trying to remember some of the others. Tamarindo from Italy, things like that. So
gnomes in Norway.
Yeah, the thing that always struck me about Lost, and again, like I think I'm probably going to run headlong into having the limitation of having only read the core book, is because Lost centers on the kidnapped changeling myth dynamic. As soon as you get out of cultural context where that's a thing. It struck me that it gets a little harder to tell those stories. Like, you couldn't tell a story about the Nunnehi in Lost. And I don't mean the big overarching group, but, like, the Nunnehi specifically, like, that myth, they're almost, like, halfway between fairies and guardian angels. They're really positive. There is not a negative angle. It's just considered auspicious to engage in one, and if you piss one off, they just will not reveal themselves to you. Like, just not a Lost story. It's the same way with some of the, are they called Eugen? I'd need to look up the term. There's a group of Indian, like, animist creatures that are often, kind of related to fairies. Sometimes they're related to monsters. It varies. But you don't have that sort of core kidnapping changeling myth. And so I was always curious if, like, anyone in Lost tried to jump into those cultures and how they tackled that absence.
So one of the metaphorical ways that I've seen it handled is there's plenty of myths of people going to and from the underworld, and that can sometimes become a proxy for being taken. Now, of course, there is mechanics for the underworld itself in the New World of Darkness universe, but just because somebody thinks that they're in the underworld doesn't mean that they actually are.
Yes, that's true. Very true.
Yeah, I think it's more like I think there's a class of fairy tales that are don't have a dark edge to them. And I've talked with a couple hardcore Lost fans who are like, oh no, like the fair folk are always monstrous. And
I just that.
It's just like Cornwall is a thing that exists. I'm sorry, like Piskies are a myth
that they're alien. That doesn't necessarily make them monsters.
Yes. Well, see, I even kind of struggle with the alien thing a little bit, because I went back at one point for a side project that unfortunately never got off the ground and read a whole bunch of old fairy stories. And the thing that struck me about most of them is even the super unsettling ones were really human. Like, they were very archetypically human. The one that stood out for me was the Bean-She. The Bean-She was this old, shriveled woman who washed beans by a river. It was kind of a river hag kind of story. And if she saw you, she'd attack you. But you could get by her by sneaking up, and she was always naked, and nursing at her, like, desiccated, fetid, rotted teeth.
Thank you for that visual.
Hey, I didn't say it was a happy story. But the thing about it is, I read it, and I'm like, there's this old desiccated woman, and the way you get by her is doing this thing that's strongly associated with human connection. Like, yeah, it feels atrocious, but at the same time, it's a story that's so archetypical of a base human need and a feeling of death and isolation. And I saw that throughout fairy tales. Like, they're wrapped up in the ambiance of alienness, but there's almost always a kernel, when you really, like, step back and look at what's going on, that's really not alien at all. It's much more, they're just a reduction of a specific archetypical need that is totally human in origin, or animus.
So, the way that I, because I'm trying to remember where I read this, but in one of the source books for the game that has to do with specifically developing True Fae, is because, of course, you know, I cannot portray somebody with a completely alien mentality because I am myself human. But one of the ways that they sort of help storytellers with that is to say that when the True Fae are interacting with the human world, whether directly because they are in the human world themselves or indirectly when they're in the hedge, is they have to accept limits and they have to follow rules. So, and those rules will tend to be along the thematic lines that you mentioned in the storytellers, in the fairy tales that you were talking about. They tend to be archetypical. Like Fae also have taboos, behaviors they always have to do, or bans, things that hurt them, that are similarly thematic. So the reason for this is because the True Fae are sort of, story-oriented, and if they always win and nobody can interact with them at all, that's not a very good story. So part of the reason they accept these limitations is so that, you know, their prey has a sporting chance, or, you know, they can have a victory that's more interesting than simply winning because they're overwhelmingly powerful.
Well, and so have you seen, they leaked the True Fae write-up from Changeling Lost 2nd edition on the Onyx Path website. Have you read that at all?
I read all of the development posts, but what I'd heard recently was that a lot of it wasn't going to be kept, so I haven't looked at it. You know.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Yeah,
they changed the lead developer, so.
Yeah, they did. But I didn't get the feeling it moved to Rose Bailey. And I didn't get the feeling that she changed too much, because between the time when it moved to her and when it got out of development wasn't that long. It was, under 5 months. So I got the feeling that she was sort of
a more direct connection than I do, and that was just a rumor that I heard. So I was taking a wait and see type approach.
Yeah, and so for context on the reason that I know that timing and whatnot is I read their development update post every Monday. They put up a timeline of where everything is, what stage of development it is, and they announce when like developers change on there. So I read those every Monday, and so that gave me a timing for like when they announced that, and then when the book moved into art direction, because they keep that on that post as well. So if anyone's ever curious, like, oh, why does he think he knows all this stuff? It's all on their blog.
Right. Well, it's just, no, I mean, this is one of the things, you know, not everybody has access or even bothers to look, but you're imparting that information now, and hopefully that's...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, I was thinking about because I did read that, not all of it, it was a really long post about the True Fae, and thinking about what you just described from the True Fae. One of the things that I think is interesting is, so Changeling the Dreaming was the first Changeling game that was released. And then Exalted came out. And when Exalted first came out, it was a prequel to World of Darkness. You what?
I love Exalted.
I love a lot about Exalted. There's certain corners of it I love more than other corners. I really like the Fairfolk. And the thing that I find kind of interesting about the Fairfolk is the Fairfolk and Exalted feel like this starting point that, depending on who wins, could become the True Fae and Changeling the Lost, or they could become the Tuatha De Danann. Because they start out and they're the Balorian Crusade, and they're hideous, and they hate form, and they hate reality. But again, they have to limit themselves to engage with it. The only way for them to come stampeding into creation to destroy it is to enter a contract and have someone agree to let them in and take on the atrocity of form to destroy form. It is so convoluted it could only have to do with the Fae. But it starts... Yeah, it starts out, and that's what the whole Fairfolk story is about. But if you read Graceful Wicked Masks, which, disclaimer, is the second edition. I haven't read the first edition.
I love Graceful Wicked Masks. And not going to lie, when I was running Exalted, I stole a bunch of stuff from Changeling to help run my True Fae.
Yeah, I mean, seriously. I wish that my only complaint about Graceful Wicked Masks, aside from, okay, we don't need this much boob, I'm sorry. The art in that book is a little over the top.
The art of Exalted
many boobies.
Problematic.
Yeah, a lot of the Exalted art was a bit much. But my only complaint about the text is, so you have all the narrative about Balorian Crusade, destroy reality, totally monstrous, ravaging humans, and then you get into the making a fairy section.
That was so hard. That's part of why I stole so much from Changeling. I was like, I don't even, what?
Oh, yeah, no, I don't. I love the whole section on what the Fae are. The Lords of Chaos, the Unshaped, the Graces, the psychology. I love all of that in Graceful Wicked Masks. The actual narrative part, I'm like, okay. But you get into it, and then suddenly it's like, and then there are these fairies that love reality, and they're addicted to it, and they have this totally different relationship. And you get into the Lords of Chaos, the Unshaped, and they can have multiple emanations, and 2 emanations could basically be members of the Balorian Church and hate reality, and 3 of them could be totally addicted to reality, and they're all emanations of the same unshaped being. And I look at Exalted and think about the direct, the order these books came out in, not so much in total intent, but just what was the line of inspiration in the office at White Wolf in my head? What do I think it was? And I can't help but kind of see it as if the Balorian Crusade had won out, if that had been the dominant fairy paradigm, you'd kind of end up with Lost. If these fair folk that are showing up that actually kind of love reality and want to have relationships with humanity, as weird as that is, win out, you kind of end up with Dreaming. I know that's total headcanon, but...
Well, I think that it's not necessarily the case that the True Fae and Lost hate humanity and don't want to have, and want to destroy reality and don't want to have relationships with them. The interesting stories that I've seen are when they do want to have relationships with reality, but on their terms and with goals that are not necessarily great for the humans that they encounter. It's one of the other themes that that the True Fae and Lost have is they're not creative. They can't create things themselves. And so that's part of why they want to take humans, is because they can then experience this creative, this creativity that humans can bring.
Well, and I think that's interesting because that's another one where it's a total 180 from the story in Old World. Because in Old World, there's this whole story with the Inanimate, who are the elemental, I don't even want to say changelings. They're not changelings. They have nothing to do with humanity. When you play an Inanimate, your physical body is an element. It's a stone or a tree or a forest or a river or whatever. You're a true Fae elemental. And you fake at being human. It's a total fake job. You're not very good at it. But there's this whole story about the fire Inanimate, and it's basically the Prometheus story. They gave fire to humans and taught humans how to create. And in Dark Ages Fae, there's this bit about weaving. Weaving is the ability to take the full force of fairy and then give it shape and limit it and turn it into something. And it's one of the two things that eventually becomes banality. But they talk about the fact that the only entities in existence that are better at weaving than fairies are humans. And again, there's this similar story about, yeah, we taught humans how to weave, and that was maybe not a great plan. Mages. And of course, no mage would ever acknowledge that a fairy taught them how to weave. And unreliable narrator, that may just be the story the Fae tell themselves. But it's this very different dynamic of, like, humans and Fae are the only creative entities in the old world of darkness. Vampires...
No, they're done being creative when they're turned.
Yeah,
it's also
and so,
probably suggested in some of the source material that it was humans who created the Fae to begin with, through their ideas and their concepts. And
by elemental forces with thought, I guess. You start thinking, a god of the hunt, god of the wind, god of the whatever, and just by its very nature of being believed in, calls it into being.
Yeah, basically. Like there was one of the stories was that a human was taken and discovered that its new master bore the face of his wife who had died several years ago and had haunted his dreams ever since. And the Fae had no idea who he was talking about, calling her by this name that didn't have any meaning to her. And yet it was definitely the same face.
Huh.
Well, and that's interesting because that could be something a little bit different from humans created the Fae. Like, that could even be... I don't know. There are so many different ways to interpret that. I'd be curious to see some of the other ways that they explored, like, that dynamic.
And I wish I could remember exactly what it was, and it wasn't ever explicitly spelled out, but it was this might be where they came from. Nobody really knows.
Yeah, well, and I really feel like most of Darkness games are better when they're not explicitly spelled out.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, when they start giving the game away, I feel like the games lose a little bit of their verve. I really like I don't like accidental inconsistency, but I love intentionally contradictory, unreliable narrator.
Absolutely, and I like it when not everything about the world is defined, because I have a very troubled relationship with lore in the world of Darkness. First off, because I don't like things that limit my flexibility as a storyteller, and I also don't like to have to contend with players who know the lore better than I do, because they're always...
I can't lie. I've been that player to a couple storytellers, and I don't know that they'll ever forgive me.
So my trap for people like that is to have antagonists that look like one thing but are actually another thing. It's great.
Yeah, well, and what I really like doing, I'm of the opinion that everything in World of Darkness is a suggestion, but I do like having a solid baseline of what is the average vampire, wraith, changeling, whatever, believe is going on? What is the culturally accepted truth? And I do like having some access to that so my players can come to the table with a concept of that. But it's always really important to me that they understand that, like, okay, all that stuff you read is your culturally accepted truth. Your characters believe that. As players, don't get into your head that means that's true. Because playing with characters like preconceptions is pretty fun.
Absolutely. I had it in my my venue style sheet for the game that I ran that there is there are two methods of attempting to arrive at the truth. There is attempting to do it out of character based on your knowledge of the system, and there is having your character make an occult check. One of these will yield accurate results.
That's good. I like that.
I do. I'm actually very, very tickled with that. All right, so where are we at on time? I'm sorry, I've been kind of sidetracked here for a minute, but I'm trying to keep up with the conversation. But you people got it covered. I appreciate.
We're about 9:20 Central, so I guess 10:20 Eastern.
Yeah, we got about 40 minutes, so we're still. What haven't we talked about yet?
I mean, if we go all the way down the rabbit hole on either of these games, there's plenty more we could talk about, I'm sure.
No, but this is a Changeling show, dude. We got to swing it back into context.
Oh no, I mean, I'm talking about Changeling.
Yeah, you are. That
sure.
is true.
Well, so I'm trying to think about other areas where the two games really have some sort of like parallel. I mean, part of the tricky part is comparing and contrasting because thematically they are such dramatically different games.
And which is kind of odd to me. I would think that, like you mentioned earlier in the show, about you'd want it to be similar enough to be a hook for dreaming players.
Yeah, but they're just like the magic is similar and the aesthetic is similar, but
some variants are the same, but
yeah, there are definitely some variants, like the Nightlings, I think it is. Darklings are very much meant to invoke like Slua and Bogies and Karamet.
The Fairest are kind of like the She.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, that's the other interesting thing. Is because Lost is more, I don't want to say generic, abstract? No, that's not the term either. It's more of a toolkit. You have these broad categories. And you have these 4 courts, but, like Jess was saying earlier, it's very local. Dreaming is interesting.
I saw more than 4 courts.
There are.
Okay.
They're the 4 major seasonal courts.
So there's multiple court systems that you can utilize. Basically, you pick one for your city to follow. There's the 4 seasonal courts, which is the most common. Then there's diurnal courts, which is dawn and dusk. Courts come in systems.
Courts of the solstice, I'm seeing here.
Yep, that's an entitlement. They're desperately trying to become a court, but they're not quite yet. So there's also day and night court, and you can have people who are members of. Hey now, you asked the question.
Yeah, I know. No, I'm sorry. You said night court, man. I was like, sorry, but
Yes,
moon and sun court. I guess that's the day and night ones.
Well, actually, they're different.
I'm seeing the 4 major seasons, the 4 major directions, moon, sun, and then dawn and dusk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's each of those. The seasonal courts and the directional courts have 4, and then the others all have 2. You basically pick a system to be your city's main system. You can have people who are members of the other courts in there, but they don't sort of really fit into the power structure of the city in the same way. So, for example, my game that I ran recently was a seasonal court game, and I had some dawn and some dusk courtiers who were in there, but they would never be able to take the high crown of the freehold. they were just sort of there doing their own thing. They weren't part of the sort of political structure of the freehold. So it was really interesting to see how the players of the seasonal courts interacted with these members from these two other courts.
Well, and so what's interesting about that is that's super localized to the point of if you come from a different area, like, you know, you could be here, but meh. Whereas with Changeling the Dreaming, while technically yes, the game does tend to be very local. That is a tendency. There is a national political structure. At the very end of the game line, they released a book, Kingdom of Willows, that dealt with one of the kingdoms, the kingdom of the South, American South, basically. And they were going to do a kingdom book, I think, for all the major kingdoms in Concordia, which is North America. And the whole major plot point that they introduced with Kingdom of Willows was about the High King of all of Concordia disappearing, and you find out why it happened. And they were in the middle of trying to give Changeling the Dreaming the same kind of big world meta that the other games had. They didn't do it until the end of the line, and so it was kind of an incomplete thought, and it didn't really fit with the way people played the game.
I think they ran out of writers when they knew that the...
Nah, they didn't run... they definitely did not run out of writers.
No, that's
true. They ran out of willingness to fund books.
That's... okay.
There were some books axed with some very passionate writers having written a lot for them already.
To get back to your original question, Peter, it's the two games are different enough that there are sort of passionate fan bases for each of them that aren't necessarily completely overlapping.
Yes.
Okay.
I would say for every Changeling fan I've met who likes both games, I've met like 10 that only likes one or the other. And of those 10, it's about evenly split. Like, I'll meet a hardcore Dreaming fan for about every hardcore Lost fan I meet.
Okay, we got a question from the Peanut Gallery. FB Fulton is asking, so what are the politics like in these different court systems? Do the dual court systems have different ideals than the four-court system?
So each court system really has its own dynamics. In the seasonal court system, as you might imagine, the crown passes in line with the season that is physically occurring in the location. And each of the courts has a different philosophy, and they're in tension, but they're generally not in open conflict. In the directional court system, they are definitely in open conflict. Like there's a lot more sort of infighting with the directional court system, and they tend to be more based around concepts than the seasonal court. The sort of two court structures, they tend to be polar opposites rather than existing along a spectrum. So, for example, I'm trying to recall. So Dawn and Dusk. Dawn is the court of hope, the court of change. Dusk is the court of despair, the court of just sort of ritually continuing on, even though you know it's hopeless. So there tends to be a much sort of bigger split between the courts in a two-court system than there is in a four-court system. The individual politics of a game sort of, to a certain extent, depend on the players. So you could get really bombastic summer courtiers who just absolutely hate the winter court and think that they shouldn't even be in court because they don't contribute or whatever. That's not typical, but it could happen if that's just how the players tend to run things. In the source material, there's a write-up on the city of Miami that's presented as very sort of summer court dominant.
Whoa,
because Miami's really hot, I guess. And so it is highly variable. It's sort of like Victor was saying. A lot of the themes and things in the write-ups are suggestions. There's definitely stereotypes of how the court system is supposed to interact. And when I was running the Changeling game that I just finished up with recently, I tried to set up a dynamic between the seasonal courts where there would be tensions, and there would be lowercase c conflict, but definitely not open infighting and let's kill all the winter courtiers sort of conflict. And
well,
to me, that's how a season court system should look.
Well, and one of the things that, to kind of contrast that with the way the courts in Dreaming work, the courts in Lost have pretty solid definitions. Like, what they stand for. They're pretty well described. The courts in Dreaming have gone through so many different revisions and alterations, and not just in terms of the additions of the game, but in the actual canon. And, now with C20, they've sort of more formally, officially tied it back to Dark Ages Fae. And the courts in Dreaming are actual supernatural phenomena in addition to being political. So every changeling has a legacy from the Seelie and the Unseelie court. And it's part of their personality. They can switch between them. They both of them influence how they play. Different other types of Fae have different legacies and court structures entirely, and they're part of their supernatural nature. And they transition between them differently. The Adhene especially have a very weird, complicated 3-court system. But what's interesting about all of that is when you go back and look at Dark Ages Fae, when you first were born as a changeling or were first given shape as a Fae, you have to be saned or given a name, and you're generally saned into a court. A handful of weird courtless fairies, but they were a strange exception. And the courts were basically maintained identities that were structured and woven magically by the Fae. And then they describe the shattering happens. And the shattering is basically the rapid reduction of magic and the onset of the modern world in classic World of Darkness. And the hook they put in C20 is that there wasn't enough magic to maintain the 4 courts of the previous system. And so they kind of collapse. And you have all the commoners, and they come up with their definition for Seelie and Unseelie. Cool, great, sure. Whatever. Those are mostly political definitions around traditionalism and progressivism, and change or maintaining what has always been. And then the resurgence happens, and the She come back. And the She bring their definition of these courts with them. And they're a little more like light, shining, noble dream and nightmare. But what's weird is they magically conflict with the commoners. And the actual saned naming magic that defines what these courts are gets murky and weird and contradictory, and it begins to affect and taint the Fae because they have these legacies in their soul. And so just the presence of the She, because they're these huge powerful things and they have all this magic to inflict, literally in some cases starts to reshape the named nature of commoners just because they no longer have a monopoly on defining the magic of the world. And so courts in Dreaming are fewer, but so much infinitely messier. And they're really messy and weird and cosmological. And I've had so many conversations with people where they're like, no, really, I just want to know, what does it mean to be Unseelie? And I'm like, do you have time to read a thesis? I can go grab it.
So I got a PowerPoint TED Talk. We could do this.
It's very different.
I think the purpose of courts is very different between the two games because, like all Changeling magic in Lost, courts were created by sort of making a deal with the forces that represent the court itself. So somebody went out and made a deal with Fall, and that's why there's a Fall court. And the purpose of doing that is another tool to sort of protect the changelings from the true Fae. For example, in the seasonal court, they willingly pass the crown between the different courts, and that's thought to be extremely baffling to the true Fae, who can't really understand why somebody would cede power voluntarily.
We got another question. Isn't there a true Fae in Lost that abducts vampires?
Probably.
Okay, that's not going to be good enough for her, I'm going to tell you now. She expects an answer.
There is a kith called Leech Fingers, which sort of damages people to heal themselves and potentially others, depending on what you purchase. So, I suppose in that sense, they do abduct people and turn them into vampires.
I think she's specifically talking about a true face with a named what we call a named boss.
There aren't really those in Lost so much. I mean, there are example ones that are given, but you sort of make up your own.
She thinks it might go by the name Bloody Mary.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the thing about Chronicles of Darkness, though. Like, saying there may have been an example given, but they tend to avoid doing the King Melg, High King David, Porthos Fitz Empress thing in Chronicles of Darkness.
Oh, not as many NPCs.
Well, there'll be example NPCs. I mean, like I said, the Conquering Heroes book, the Night Horrors book, are kind of all about giving you these big fleshed out NPCs. But it's not like they're going to then take them and do they're going to show up in 7 source books with this epic arc of story, because they don't want to inflict that on you. Like, it's all kind of designed to be a toolkit that you get to pull from.
Yeah, it's more like this is how you might design a character if you were inclined to do so. However, this is not that this person exists in your specific game.
That's right.
Yeah.
I refer you to page 95.
Sorry, I feel like I didn't answer the question, but I can't...
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. She's a big girl. She'll get over it.
Well, and to jump back to something that Jess said, before we were talking about Bloody Mary, when you talked about the seeding power and the seasonal courts...
We almost said it a third time.
That's actually one of the things they pulled from... It's one of the sort of invocations from Dreaming, where it doesn't mean in any way the same thing, but I think it's kind of there as a nod to the fans of both games. That's what the Fae used to do in Dark Ages. That was their court structure, and they did seed power. They ward. One season kind of wanted to win out, but that did not go well for the Fae. That war did not do them any favors, but ultimately they did seed power. And now only the Seelie, which is sort of like the summer, spring, dawn, day court, holds power, and that's a big a point of major political contention. That's kind of the thrust of a lot of the canon plot, the problems with the Seelie never giving up power. So the fact that they made that a major plot point is kind of confusing the true Fae is an interesting nod back to Dreaming.
Full disclosure, I was definitely an Unseelie player back when I was playing a lot of Dreaming, so I get where you're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, the Seelie are jerks, especially the She. They're just.
I found them
jerks.
very. I found the problem that I had with the Seelie Unseelie dynamic is the same problem I have with alignments in D&D. I find them extremely limiting.
Yeah. Especially if your character class requires that you maintain, like paladins and clerics and shit, that you have to actually you got to follow the rules or they take your toys away, kind of thing.
Yeah, also, it assumes that there is one unified conception of what is good. That bothers me.
well, except the Seelie was never good. I mean, Seelie was never about being good.
It wasn't more willful, I guess.
I mean, the Seelie would have you believe, especially the Seelie She, that being Seelie is good. But especially in C20 and a little bit in second edition, they leaned much more heavily towards Seelie being the court of preservation, and the Unseelie court being the court of change and dynamism. There's a little bit of the Dream Nightmare aesthetic that's left, but they mostly got rid of that in C20. And I was really happy about that change. I never liked the Nightmare Dream division. I I kind of like the idea of the Seelie as villains, to be honest.
I think the day and night court in Lost draws heavily on that, because the day court is the court of shame and the court of just sort of trying to put everybody in very narrow boxes. They also tend to be more physically attractive than members of the night court, and so I think that was a bit of a nod towards the she.
Yeah, that's definitely a nod towards the she. Yeah, that's one thing that I think is fascinating about Dreaming is the whole she thing. And I think there are 14 courts now that they brought the Danon back. And man, the players that love the she are just like, well, what do you mean? If what do you mean? Like, a quarter of the line devoted to my single kith is a problem. That's not a problem. I demand more.
Right? I should get at least a paragraph. God damn it!
Like,
I feel the same way about vampire players.
Yeah. Oh, that is so true. I mean, no, not at all.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
I love vampire players. I don't know why I said that.
No, it's fine.
It's perfectly fine.
Word, I promise. Yeah.
Oh shit.
But yeah, I find this whole like. The she represent feudalism and autocracy and control, and players love them. And I'm like, they're kind of written as villains, guys. Like,
this is problematic.
No, see, like, in a game system fraught with villains, I mean, come on, how much more villainous can they be than say your average Simishe? Just saying.
Oh, I got to be honest. The average she is way more villainous.
Really?
Oh yeah. Wait,
the reason they call them fiends, you know that, right?
No, I was just saying that there was an interesting theory that I read a little while ago that that people tend to valorize the system of sort of government that is the opposite of whatever they're currently experiencing.
Uh-huh.
This is sort of
okay, you broke up there. You're gonna have to repeat that.
Oh, I read it to valorize this government that is sort of the opposite of what they're most familiar with. So this idea of, very charismatic leadership that's very controlling, and, there's no social mobility and everybody sort of has their place and they stay in there their entire lives, is sort of the opposite of, at least, the system of...
Okay, you're having serious issues with your mic.
Yeah, I think I think you're losing bandwidth.
Oh, shoot.
I was able to catch most of it, but you definitely slipped out a couple times.
And I only speak English, so
I sort of caught it.
Okay, if you could answer, that'd be go.
Yeah, I mean, she was talking about how people valorize the system of government that is the opposite whatever they're experiencing. So so someone in a very autocratic, controlling environment would kind of idealize and dream of perfect freedom. Someone who's in a society that, allows everyone a lot of freedom, but then there are a lot of other people doing things they don't like, will lean towards, authoritarian government, because then that'll get rid of all those people that are doing things that I don't want them to do. That more or less seemed to be the gist of what she was talking about. I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of that in the she. I think they're supposed to represent that. What I find interesting is that so many players sort of play them non-critically. They're like, the she are great, and I'm going to be a paladin, and this is going to be fantastic, and Arthurian legends, and no, there's nothing wrong with them at all. And I'm like, man, this is the world of darkness. The leaders are all terrible. Like, the she don't get a pass. In fact, they're kind of worse. Like, the Leonin are monsters. So are Balor. Like, come on, man.
It's back to what you were saying earlier about how sometimes Changeling players are very, very immoral in what they have their characters do.
Very, very amoral. Yes, that is absolutely true. The Fae do not care. They do not have a moral compass. Completely. They are archetypical form. That's it.
Completely out of fucks.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, I guess that shows that it's a very compelling narrative that these types and these kits have created, that people just sort of buy into it and are like, yeah, this is how I am.
Yeah, it really is. One of the things that I want to play with, I don't know the best way to do it. It's one of those, like, I have all these cosmological, like, high-minded concepts I want to play with, but I don't know how to distill it into a good story that'll, like, gel for players, is the weird tension between, do you have a right to your own identity, or is humanity telling you what you are? Because, especially in C20, there are a few new kits that are like, well, not new, but like from some of the books that were only ever released in foreign language form. And one in particular, the Warpletinger, they were Chimera very recently. And then there were enough humans that bought into the Jackalope myth and other related myths that they were able to garner enough glamour and take form and go through the Changeling way and become fully realized changelings.
That's awesome.
But that relationship is really interesting. They only get to have form because humans believe in them.
That's what I was saying earlier. But
at the same time, like, changelings are all about naming and shaping and weaving, and it becomes this whole, like, do you have, like, is this identity really yours? Like, do you have a say in your own life? I don't quite know how to tap it. What was that? I didn't quite catch that.
I said, or do you have control of identity, or is it a social construct?
Exactly. It's just like I need to like chew on that a bit longer and figure out how to turn it into like a story that will work at a table.
Well, what immediately came to my mind was having a group that had their identity completely changed and not for the better.
Mm-hmm. And
figure out, well, should we help them? Can we help them? Like, what do we do with this?
Yeah, it's so something from Graceful Wicked Masks that I thought was interesting, that I know Simon has used a little bit, and I kind of want to, but I'm not far enough into my Chronicle for, is there's this idea of questing into an unshaped Fae. And the unshaped Fae are huge amorphous concepts, and they never enter reality. And so one of the things I kind of want to do at some point is have regions of the dreaming basically be unshaped Fae still. Like, they never entered reality. They never limited themselves to a single body.
What's waiting extra dimensionally for something to believe in it.
No, not at all. This is entirely different. The unshaped don't want to be believed in. They don't need to be believed in. They can exist in the deepest recesses of subconscious collective thought, and that is fine. That's where they're happy. But the concept was shaped Fae would quest into them and bring just a tiny little bit of their structured form and what they had learned from creation into the unshaped Fae. And by doing so, they'd give the unshaped Fae a little bit of an understanding about reality without forcing that Fae to limit themselves. But in exchange, they would get something. They'd get a grace. They'd get an ability to redefine themselves by taking some of that raw, wild energy from the unshaped. So I kind of want to do a story where it's like, you've been changed for the worse. What would it take for you to retake control of your identity? As it turns out, it would take a lot. You have to go into this like deep, untread place that is sentient and sees you and wants something from you. And what are you going to have to give up to reform yourself? And I think that would be really interesting.
That sounds a lot like the hedge in Lost.
You are breaking up really bad.
I think Can you? I think it would be better if I dropped the call temporarily.
Yeah, and then and I'll grab you.
Call back in.
Or come back yourself. I think you can do that. Anyway, you still there, Victor?
Yeah, I'm still here.
All right, so we'll wait. She'll be back. It sounds like she's having internet issues. Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Then you're still breaking up.
Yeah.
Did you move your mic or anything?
No, I didn't.
There you go.
Yeah, you're good for the moment.
Okay.
You can dive in, fingers crossed.
I was sort of all of the things that are plugged into my computer and sort of jiggling them into the. So maybe something came loose. Maybe that's what happened.
And you're still breaking up a little. But it's okay. We've only got a few minutes left. Anywho.
Yeah, but you were saying something about the hedge?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that the hedge is as a realm, it's alive, and different parts of it have different characteristics. It's also psychoactive, so it reacts to the things and people that are in it, and you can bring things back from the hedge that can serve as it's called hedge spinning, and every changeling can just sort of instinctively do this. The hedge is also a very dangerous place, like the path, and you spend too long in the thorn, rip you apart, and you'll go insane. Like that is the thing that will happen.
Yeah, and I mean, I always got the feeling that the hedge... I mean, I don't want to say I got the feeling. The hedge is definitely the corollary to the dreaming. The hedge is definitely a lot more dangerous. Like, you can stay in the dreaming for an extended period of time, and you're not going to die. You'll probably go insane, although it's through a very different mechanism than what drives you insane in Lost. But yeah, I mean, they're both invoking a lot of similar ideas, and the dreaming is definitely sentient. It is definitely aware, and it's definitely psychoreactive.
Yeah, the hedge also occasionally opens its doors for humans.
I mean, I would assume that's half of how humans get stuck in Fairy.
Yeah.
Well, get kidnapped and get stuck in Fairy because the hedge, like, agents of the True Face don't have to find them in order for them to become a changeling. Sometimes people just wander around in the hedge and go insane. Like, there's a creature type that is made on the hedge and has just forgotten how to make for too long.
Alright, we're not... I'm sorry, Jess. I'm only getting one word out of 3. I am so sorry. Anyway, let's go ahead and call it for the night, guys. Get your plug in again, Vic.
Yeah, I co-hosted Changeling the Dreaming podcast, Walking Away from Arcadia. You can look us up on Facebook or walkingawayfromarcadia.podbean.com. It's less casual conversation. We more pick a topic and try and, like, rip it apart and make it like what you would have your players listen to get up to speed on a concept. We wanted it to kind of be... The Dreaming books can be kind of contradictory, and we wanted to sort of tackle all those contradictions in one place, one topic at a time. Not every episode is that, but a lot of them are. So if you're curious about the game, I like to think it's a pretty good starting resource.
There you go. Jess, I don't know if you're...
Posting a kitchen. You should know.
She's cut out completely.
Yeah.
I said,
Oh, sweetie, I am so sorry. Anywho, alright, I want to thank our guests tonight, Victor and Jess. We got quite a bit of conversation in before her connection took a dump. So, Victor and Jess, if you can maybe get a good night out. Everybody say good night.
good night.
Night.